Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much for that very generous welcome. And of course, thank you everyone for coming by this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, it's always an honor to be part of the University of Manchester's research sort of endeavors. The paper on which today's talk is based is very much work in progress. And it's an attempt to, how should I put it, think about the links between development and democracy, and in particular think about the role that dignity, the idea of dignity, might play in this link between democracy and development. Now, dignity has, as this audience will know, become extremely prominent in conversations about development. The UN, of course, talks about sustainable development goals, and it's sort of emphasizing a roadmap to dignity by 2030. So it's probably worthwhile to think about, what does dignity have to do, and how might understandings of dignity inform our practices of development and democracy. Now, as Sam mentioned, this project sits between, or rather this paper sits between many different projects. So it builds on the just concluded book project. It relates to my ongoing research on the politics of migration and the political factors that spur migration. And it also links to future work on development and democracy in the rising powers. So this is work that will be built in several directions. Now, among the most remarkable achievements of the 20th century, at least its last quarter, was the proliferation in the number of polities that might be called democracies. The reversal of these achievements in recent years is therefore naturally a major source of worry for political analysts in our times. Now, these twin processes have generated a very rich literature on transitions to and backsliding from democracy. But of course, we need to also think about the kinds of literatures that step beyond these dichotomies. Scholars have, moving away from the dichotomy of transition and backsliding, also taken pains to explain the varied processes through which democracy is consolidated, thereby producing a global divergence of democracy. We've also learned much about defining and measuring the quality of democracy and the ways in which quality of democracy impinges upon and shapes transitions, consolidations, and backsliding. Additionally, some scholars have explored the ways in which democratic deepening develops the quality of any democracy. Such scholars have tended to assume that there is a theoretical and political coherence between consolidation, quality, and depth while discussing democratic processes. So they've used the terms quality, consolidation, and depth almost interchangeably. Others have contested this view, outlined the disjunctions between consolidation, quality, and depth, arguing that the conceptual and empirical connections between them may not always be symmetrical. So beyond questions of transition and backsliding and of consolidation and quality, scholars are increasingly debating the contours of democratic depth or deepening democracy. Now, how could we define democratic deepening? What's one way to think about and pin down our understanding of democratic deepening? Clearly, we have to distinguish between democratic depth from democratic quality. Yeah? We need to think about political participation that extends, not substitutes, extends electoral practices and representative institutions. Perhaps think of the mechanisms that allow oppressed and marginalized social groups to gain political influence. So a provisional definition, this is not cast in stone, of course, this is a provisional definition of democratic deepening, might be that it's a process through which political actors recognize, endorse, and advance the claims of socially disadvantaged and historically oppressed communities to equal membership in the political community. And so this means stepping away from the usual domain of thinking about the adoption and implementation of social welfare programs, of affirmative action policies, to ways in which ideas, feelings, and practices of dignity are nurtured by political agents. Now, why does any of this matter? It perhaps matters because of the creeping majoritarianism that we see across the world today, whether it's in developing countries or developed countries. We see racial, ethnic, and religious supremacists on the upswing. We see growing economic inequalities, and I'm sure this audience is aware of the figures pertaining to the top 1% incomes and how much they are galloping ahead. There is also the widespread anxiety that poverty foments hostility to democracy and that ethnic politics undermines democracy. So there are, therefore, a number of reasons why we might want to think about how we can deepen democracy and the ways in which one could deepen democracy. So in this paper, in terms of thinking about specifically what we are going to do, I'm going to engage with the emerging debate on the factors that deepen democracy, and in some ways try and challenge the assumption that the factors which facilitate the transition to democracy also facilitate the deepening of democracy. So we have to think about the two processes separately. Transition is one analytic cluster. Consolidation is another analytic cluster. Quality is a third analytic cluster. Deepening of democracy is a fourth cluster of things that we're interested in. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on the factors that might contribute to the deepening of democracy. Not the transition, not the consolidation, not the quality, but the deepening of democracy. Yeah, so I think that I should make very clear. But typically, the factors that have been used to explain transition have also been used to explain deepening of democracy. So, for instance, we've been told by Seymour Martin Lipset that economic development contributes to democracy. And some scholars have said, therefore, economic development would also contribute to deepening of democracy. Another cluster of explanations suggests that elite bargains results in the transition, successful transition of democracy. Following that, people have said that elite bargains have contributed to the deepening of democracy. A third cluster of scholars would say that cultural values, and here I'm thinking about Ron Engelhardt, Christian Welzel, for instance, they suggest that it's cultural values that result in the transition to democracy. And following from that, people have said that it's cultural values that deepen democracy. So again, there are resonances in the literature, and there are assumptions that the factors that result in the transition to democracy also result in the deepening of democracy. Underlying all of this is, of course, assumptions, and often unstated assumptions, of development. What is development? What do we understand by development? People who talk about economic development leading to democracy, for instance, often assume that development is about economic growth. But of course, this audience knows that development is much more than economic growth. There are questions of freedoms and capabilities, and there are broader questions of social progress. Some of these ideas of development find their way into understandings of democracy, but they are sometimes left implicit rather than made explicit. A fourth cluster of explanations, and as you will see, cluster of explanations to which I am sympathetic to, refers to the social forces, or might be called the social forces approach to thinking about transitions to democracy as well as deepening of democracy. And this way of thinking about deepening of democracy recognizes the disjunctions between quality, consolidation, and transition. And this draws, of course, on Barrington Moore Jr.'s well-known work on social classes and the ways in which social classes contributed to democratization. Borrowing from that insight, but also nuancing it, one can think about the ways in which ethnic politics, conjoined with class politics, results in a deepening of democracy, so long as it is underpinned by ideas of dignity. And it's accompanied by emancipatory narratives. Now, what is this thing called dignity? And I think we've been using this term so far without really defining it. And I think there are various ways in which the idea of dignity has been defined, has been understood. Again, provisionally, one could think of dignity as a shared quality that alludes to something of an equal social standing. It may not be about equal resources, but it's about equal social standing, which stem from narratives of emancipation. So it's a notoriously slippery term, dignity. It's often conflated with honor, for instance. But I think it's useful and important to distinguish between dignity and honor, because honor can often possess supremacist undertones. It can be rooted in aristocratic privileges. In a way, dignity can also be used in aristocratic terms, but I think it's for the purpose of this lecture and for my work, I draw a distinction between dignity and honor and think of dignity as a much more shared quality, not something that is based on one's aristocratic privileges or sort of superior social standing. I draw on the case of India, which is the world's largest democracy, or at least it prides itself as being the world's largest democracy, which has been uninterrupted, which has seen uninterrupted democratic rule since 1950, except for a brief period. But of course, we've also been told that there are degrees of democracy within India. Some areas within India are far more democratic than others. But broadly, the literature suggests that there is some evidence of deepening democracy across India since at least 1989. They refer to widening electoral participation, effective contestation among political parties, as well as vibrant popular movements against the exclusionary politics of the Indian state. Broad theories of democratic deepening are of course relevant to the Indian context because of the growing increase of ethnic supremacy or what one might more bluntly call Hindu majoritarianism, the growing economic inequality that India has seen in recent decades, which dissonate with the other ideas and the other practices that we just talked about, widening electoral participation, effective political contestation, and vibrant popular movements. I just mentioned that that scholars have referred to degrees of democracy within India. So you have enormous subnational variation, and that is to be expected in a country the size and diversity of India. So you have the positive deviations within India, the cases of the Keralas, the supposed cases of the West Bengals, the cases of the Tamil Nadus, and you have the negative deviations, particularly the two large northern states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, to the extent that Bihar has sometimes been called a degraded democracy, an illiberal democracy as well. And in some ways, the news coverage for Bihar doesn't do it much credit. So you have such sort of headlines such as India's corner of mystery, Bihar's poor and lawless. You have headlines such as India's boom leaves one state in dark ages. And then you have headlines about Bihar's bureaucracy being utterly corrupt, for instance. And at the heart of all of these sorts of stories and narratives of corruption, you have at the center stage one man in particular, the person who was chief minister of the state of Bihar for 15 years. And this is a headline which I think very nicely captures the kind of brickbats that this one chief minister of the state has acquired. After rise from poverty to power, the luster fades for a folk hero from India. So this chief minister was a folk hero, and then he is supposed to have done all kinds of horrible things. We will come back to appraising the role of this particular chief minister. But the overall narrative of India moving forward, Bihar falling backwards, is something that the news reports have also sort of testified to. Increasingly, we are being asked to reconsider the Bihar story. And there are two narratives here that have come to become very dominant. One narrative is that the state of Bihar was indeed a bottomless pit between 1990 and 2005. But since 2005, there has been a rapid turnaround in the state. So this was a state marred by corruption, by nepotism, and now you have a very different kind of Bihar. The second narrative around Bihar is that what Bihar saw between 1990 and 2005 was a politics of dignity. And this politics of dignity undermined development. So this narrative tries to say that, well, there are these two different ways of thinking about politics. One is a politics of dignity and one is a politics of development, and the two are quite different. And classic sort of work in this vein is Jeff Witso, the social anthropologist, who's written about democracy against development, using the case of Bihar. The argument in this paper is somewhat different. It suggests, building on the book that Sam just talked about, which I shall sort of plug again, is that the vocabularies of dignity become ingrained among subordinate classes between 1990 and 2005. And you see this in a number of ways, which I shall just describe. Such vocabularies contributed to dignifying development. So rather than seeing a contest between dignity and development, or democracy and development, we can think about the ways in which these narratives dignified development, and by dignifying development, they may have contributed to deepening democracy in Bihar. So the argument here, it proceeds in three steps. One is, of course, it reappraises the Bihar case, and suggests that, yes, some of the things that have been said about the politics of dignity they hold. The second, that these vocabularies of dignity dignified development. So the idea of development came to be dignified and being imbued with the vocabulary of dignity. And thirdly, that these dignified ways of thinking about development contributed to the deepening of democracy. This is particularly interesting despite the very low administrative and fiscal capacity of the Bihar state, despite the appalling economic and social indicators that the state has been marred by, and despite a very weak industrial base. So Bihar has none of the advantages that many other states sometimes have when it comes to thinking about development. This story of Bihar also contributes to broadly thinking about deepening democracy. The existing approaches to thinking about deepening democracy tend to focus on institutions, or they emphasize state-society relations that promote development, or they emphasize redistributive measures that reduce economic inequalities. The assumption in much of the existing literature is that democratic deepening contributes to democratic consolidation, to democratic quality, and to transitions to democracy. But what we see is in the Bihar case, and what the Bihar case reminds us, is that there are often disjunctions. Democratic deepening may not reinforce democratic consolidation in the way we might expect. Democratic deepening may be perceived as undermining democratic quality. So one has to think, as I said earlier, about democratic depth slightly differently from transitions, consolidations, and depth. To draw attention to the ways in which the ideas of dignity became part and parcel of Bihar's politics, I'm going to distinguish between what one might call ideational themes, where one focuses on the narratives of dignity, on affective themes, where one might focus on the feelings of dignity, and practical themes, which refer to the actions and policy outcomes, or the lack of them for that matter, which might affect dignity, and which might sort of make dignity part and parcel of the ways of thinking. A bit more about Bihar broadly. So in 2011, Bihar state in northern India, in the northeastern sort of part of India, it's a tiny state with a population of over 100 million. So think about two Englands being fitted into the size of Wales. I think that's probably one way to think about this. GDP per capita less than that of Papua New Guinea. It's a very fertile and flood-prone area of eastern India, which comes with its own advantages and disadvantages. In medieval times, it was a thriving Mughal entrepot till it was sort of converted into a colonial backwater after British annexation in 1757. And the colonial land tenure regime continues to be relevant today because of the way in which it cemented Bihar's caste hierarchy, or the hierarchy of ethnic, if you will, groups that exist in Bihar. This is a very simplistic presentation of the way in which caste operates in this part, in this region of India, but it perhaps suffices for the purpose. So society broadly is distinguished or divided into a few hierarchical categories, which might be called ranked ethnicities in the political science literature. So you have the top three sort of communities which tend to be dominant in economic and social terms. In the Bihar case, they are often referred to as twice-born groups for a number of ritual reasons that need not worry us here. But they make up about 20% of the state's population. You have at the base of the heap, really outside of social sort of considerations, this group of outcasts that are considered or called untouchables. And that, again, whether they were ritually called untouchable or not is a matter of debate. But then the way in which colonial land tenure systems operated, they were effectively cast outside of landholdings, etc. They make up about 15% of the state's population. And you have in between this group, which is at the base of the caste pyramid, who might be called the in-betweeners. They are agriculturalists, artisans, weavers, etc., who are not quite pure, but they are not quite untouchable either. So they are sort of in between. They have been called lower castes or backward castes or various other terms. So they're not as destitute as the so-called untouchables, but they're not clearly as dominant or as privileged as those on the top. And they make up, as you see, about 60% of the state's population. This caste hierarchy was nurtured under colonial rule, thrived under post-colonial scenario. So if you look at the communal composition of the Bihar Legislative Assembly, the decision-making body of the state of Bihar, and you see again the sort of fourfold distinction, so the high castes, the so-called lower castes, the untouchable castes, and the Muslims who were socially proximate to the lower castes and sometimes to the untouchable castes. You see that in relation to the population, the high caste dominance over the legislative assemblies was paramount. It was absolute. It was total. And you see this across 3 decades of Indian independence, or 4 decades almost, from 1952 right down to 1985. It was the high caste population in the high caste representation in the Legislative Assembly in 1985 was twice that of their population in the state's population. And not only did caste thrive under post-colonial government, it was also buttressed by brutal repression. Here are images of massacres of Dalits, or as the untouchable groups have decided to and urge others to call themselves. Dalits is a political category to refer to a group which is which was historically called untouchables. You have massacres perpetrated by caste armies, and here is this gentleman posing with the rifle with which he killed several tens and 20 Dalit members of the untouchable communities, posing very bravely and proudly with his rifle. And you have brutal repression of Muslims. And here I think this image is particularly sort of jarring, because this is a case where Muslim villagers have been massacred and the police goes in and rounds up the Muslims, accusing them of having been in some way involved in the massacre of their own wives and children. So you see caste coming to play a very, very central role in the way Bihar's politics shaped up in colonial and post-colonial times. Till around the end of the 1980s and about 1990, when ideas of dignity come to become quite sort of central to the ways of thinking about politics in the state. And in March 1990, this character who earlier headlines sort of made fun of, as you might have picked up, called him a buffoon, etc. This character becomes the chief minister of the state of Bihar in 1990, and he brings with him a very, very clear commitment to, if not practical ability to enforce, but certainly a very clear narrative, I should say, maybe not even commitment, a narrative of dignity, the narrative that he would ensure that the state's oppressed populations would be able to live lives of dignity. So the idea of dignity, or in local parlance, izzat, or sometimes also called samman, these ideas become extremely central to his ways of thinking about politics and about dignity. When he takes office, his oath-taking ceremony is a very straightforward, simple affair, and you can contrast that with the oath-taking ceremonies that have usually been sort of common across Indian states, which are marked usually by a great deal of pomp and splendor. You see, there were very famous images of him cycling to office, whereas most post-colonial sort of rulers in India would never even think about cycling to work. You have the travel writer William Dalrymple, whose works one could sort of take with a bit of salt in any case. But here he has an interview with villagers in rural Bihar who complain about the chief minister, Lalu Yadav, accusing him of encouraging low castes to rise up against us. And then they use the patronizing term Harijan to describe the untouchables, saying that they refuse to work for us. The government does not protect us. It is on their side. So there's a complaint that the lower castes are rising up under this person who's the chief minister of Bihar. In my own work, I've sort of interviewed people and been able to speak with people and hear exchanges of people. This was at a observance, at a funeral ceremony, where people talked about how they could never have dared to sit on chairs, on plastic chairs, till about the 1990s. And their ability to sit on plastic chairs, their ability to actually continue to sit when their social superiors passed them by, was a major difference that came about in their lives after 1990. So, and they use the terms of izzat and samman, honor, dignity, to sort of refer to the ways in which their lives changed. So the idea of dignity becomes sort of quite key, not only to Yadav's political sort of narrative, but also becomes quite central to the ways in which people themselves talk about how they relate to one another. We also at the same time think about, or are able to discern, what one might call feelings of equality, feelings of dignity. And this is quite crucial historically, because this is all happening around the 1990s, when you have a very rabid Hindu majoritarian movement that begins to gain popularity across northern India in particular. This is led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which currently rules India. And in the early 1990s, there was a very widespread political campaign to reclaim a disputed region within North India from the Muslims, as it was called, and reclaim that for the Hindus. So it was around the dispute was around a mosque, which the Hindu nationalists claimed was built over a temple, which now some Buddhists claim was in turn built over a Buddhist monastery, but that's a different story. And at the center of that movement was the BJP, which led this grand chariot procession across North India in order to liberate that particular disputed region within North India from Muslim clutches and sort of take it over back for the Hindus. The procession caused riots in their wake, because there were incendiary speeches that were made by Hindu nationalists provoking local communities against Muslim minorities, and there was a general atmosphere of fear and terror that was very, very common across northern India. Now, the procession was to pass through the state of Bihar to reach the particularly disputed site. And as it entered Bihar, Yadav, who was the chief minister of Bihar, made this particular speech, which I think goes a long way to demonstrate how he contributed to feelings of equality and feelings of dignity for a large chunk of the state's population. Sorry, do we have voice? Does this? Okay, it's subtitles, so you can see the subtitles, and you wouldn't have understood the language in any case because it was in Hindi. So, but you can see the subtitles. And this is addressed to a mixed group of Hindus and Muslims, where he's making this appeal to keep the peace, and he's appealing to the BJP leaders to return from Bihar and not continue. And he says how he has given a great deal of respect to the political leaders for, despite political opposition, and then goes on to talk about how the life of the common man, common person, is also sort of quite central. And this is the leader of the BJP who does not heed the warning. And you can see the very masculine and the very sort of aggressive posturing on the part of the Hindu nationalist leaders. But to cut a long story short, Yadav arrests this particular politician and sends him right back from Bihar, making giving a very, very clear signal to the state's population that he was not going to tolerate any kind of communal disharmony, and that as far as he was concerned, the state's diverse populations were all equal, that no one group would be allowed to dominate over others. Now, in a context where, as you saw just earlier, there was this great deal of rioting, terror, brutal violence against religious and social minorities, in such a context, when the chief minister not only stands up, takes a stand, but also sends the leader of the foremost Hindu nationalist sort of movement, arrests them and sends them away from Bihar, that sends a very clear signal to the state's Muslim and untouchable populations, who had hitherto been used to being treated as, at best, political clients, as worst, dispensable subjects. So the feeling of dignity that Yadav's actions are able to sort of inculcate was something that one has to see in this regard. And then there were other ways in which these feelings of dignity were imbibed among populations. Hymns such as these were popularized across the state, urging members of the low caste communities to get themselves educated, to go to school, to learn to read and write, which is something that they had not been allowed to do for centuries. In a very interesting way, Yadav's entire political project involved inviting the rural poor into Patna, into the capital city of the state, on huge rallies, and here he is inaugurating a political rally. Now, at one level, this was a nuisance to the state's elites, the elites of the capital city, because it meant millions of people milling around on the streets of the capital city doing nothing really. But at another level, this was a way of communicating with the state's population, especially the rural poor, that they were very welcome to come into the capital city, that they didn't have to worry about coming there and not having a place to sort of stay or being evicted or thrown out. Of course, the rally was always a matter of a few days, but for those few days, this was a carnival for the rural poor, as it were, that was sponsored by the state government's resources. I have another clip which will not, because the voice won't play, but that's the way in which he addresses Parliament, India's national parliament, in a very rustic kind of English. So he's very clear that he wants to speak English, but it's an English that is a very rustic and a very rural English, of which he is absolutely very confident. He's not at all ashamed of it, because as far as he can see, this is the way in which most Indians would speak English, and there's nothing to sort of hide or be ashamed of, but that's a clip we can't play. And this is a clip I mean, it's not a clip, it's pictures of festivals, observances of the so-called low castes, of the untouchable communities, which were simply not allowed to be held before Yadav takes over power, but which now, under his regime, these festivities were officially sanctioned, officially endorsed, and often state resources were provided for them. So these were some ways in which feelings of dignity were imbibed by the poor under Yadav's regime. And of course, we have to be very clear that this didn't result in a peaceful, harmonious society at all. What in fact one does see is a simmering of the caste conflict, which we noted earlier, but with a slight difference. And here one has to think about the practices of dignity. Whereas in the past, the untouchables and the Muslims tended to be the victims, what now began to happen, at least the untouchables, not so much the Muslims, but the untouchables were able to retaliate in ways that they would not have even dreamt of earlier. Now, this might not quite sound as music to liberal ears. We are used to thinking about development in relatively peaceful terms, dignity in relatively harmonious terms. But the ways in which the practices of dignity began to sort of emerge in Bihar suggested that now you were able to see a situation where untouchable groups were able to retaliate, hit back, often violently. That said, the number of atrocities against the untouchables in this state continue to remain less than elsewhere. And perhaps the retaliation had something to do with the way in which those numbers might have reduced. So here are some figures from the official sort of statistics, which suggest that the number of atrocities per 100 people within the state of Bihar was much less than the national average, and certainly less than some select other Indian states as well. But they increase as soon as Yadav's regime falls and the new regime sort of takes over. And finally, when one thinks of practices of dignity, there were a number of policies that were introduced, foremost among them being policies for affirmative action for the lower castes in public sector and university senates. That resulted in the 60% population that we saw right in the beginning being slightly better represented in public sector and university senates. There were policies to eliminate tax on toddy. Does anyone here know what toddy means? So it's an alcoholic beverage that is made by tapping trees, and which is not a very profitable business, but it's something that is done in a very informal way across northern and eastern India. This is something that mostly low caste or untouchable groups would engage in. Again, the colonial regime had imposed taxes on the cultivation of toddy, which were eliminated under his regime. Do people here know what slums are? There's general sort of. So slums are usually seen as an eyesore in capital cities, and all efforts are made to evict or to remove slums. Yadav's government regularized slums in the city of Patna, allowed those slums to continue to remain and gave them legal sort of existence. Do people know what cow sheds are? There's a bit of murmuring. Okay, where cows are kept to and looked after. It's unthinkable thinking of cow sheds in urban areas. By law, they were not allowed, and they continue to be disallowed in Indian cities, as perhaps in most parts of the world. Again, Yadav's government allowed cow sheds to flourish in urban areas. Institutions of higher education were renamed, and instead of being called generic names, they were named after civil rights statesmen within India. And saints who had championed social equality in the 16th and 17th centuries were officially commemorated in his regime. So in some of these ways, these practices of dignity that Yadav's regime sought to inculcate perhaps made a major difference in the ways in which people engaged with ideas of dignity. But the biggest change comes around, and if you will recall the earlier table that I showed, in the communal composition of the Bihar Legislative Assembly. And we see that since the 1990s, the high caste representation in the Bihar Legislative Assembly progressively dwindles and becomes much more in tune with the state, with their population in the state. And you see the lower caste population creeping up. It's still not the same as the population, as their population in the state, but it is considerably higher than it was in the previous period. So if you saw the figures in 1985, the lower caste population was in the region of 27%, and you see in as late as 2015, the lower caste population is in fact higher than their share of the state's population. So the Bihar Legislative Assembly becomes much more representative in a sense than it was ever before. And this increased representation enables the practice of dignity to have some manifestation. Now, none of this gets reflected in the human development indices, and this remains a major sort of challenge for the state of Bihar and a major point of criticism. We see that in 1991, the state of Bihar is this dark red blob in eastern India, along with its other states. I'm not sure what that color indicates, but it's at the bottom of the heap. In 2006, that position remains. So let's be very clear, none of the ideas, feelings, and practices of dignity that we talked about earlier may have resulted in an improvement in the Human Development Index for the state. And I think that is the point that I want to drive in this lecture, that a lot of the ideas and practices and feelings of dignity to which we might be talking about which we might be talking, may not always result in the kinds of development indices and improvements that we are perhaps looking at. So think of the disjunctions with which I started out, and think of the disjunctions that I'm sort of referring to here. Now, what explained all of these sorts of deepenings of democracy? And I mentioned a bit about the social sort of forces, and I want to just here very quickly talk about the class and caste alliances that Yadav's regime was built on, and the ways in which they built on peasant movements, communist-led struggles of agrarian labor, socialist-led caste struggles and a number of untouchable movements. So there was social basis to which Yadav's regime was speaking. But the disjunction also arose from a fragmentation within the state, a fragmentation between the political side of the state, which tended to be essentially lower caste, and the executive side of the state, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, which tended to be higher caste. So that conflict, that social conflict, found its way into the executive and the legislative relations, resulting in this kind of dissonance within the regime. What we do see after Yadav's departure from power in 2005 is relatively high rates of human development. And this might seem to subscribe to or confirm the turnaround story that I mentioned earlier. But I think what's key to really keep in mind here is the continuities rather than the discontinuities. Yadav's regime probably laid the basis for a number of the developments that we see after 2005, which result in improvements in the Human Development Index, even if the Human Development indices in Bihar are not the highest in India. So in conclusion, I think what I want to refer again, and I want to sort of summarize briefly the three major takeaways that one could sort of have from this paper. First, think about the role of social forces in deepening democracy. And these social forces can be messy, they can be unpredictable, they do not have the kinds of implications on development indices that we might want. But do consider the link between development and democracy. That link is important. It's not enough to wish it away or wave it away and say that it does not matter. But it might not work out in the ways in which we think or we would like it to work out. And finally, thinking about dignifying development means more than having that word in a UN document. It means more than having that in legislative speeches. Dignity means many different things to many different people, and that has to be socially sort of understood. But if one did dignify development in the ways in which we've talked about just now, which resonate with historically oppressed groups, we might not be improving human development indices, but we would certainly be contributing to deepening democracy. I think I'll end on that note. Thank you very much for your patience. Hi.